again, we're going to continue with Walt Disney and American Original. Today, we're going to finish section 1 with chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4. From the October 1917 issue of The Voice magazine of McKinley High School, Chicago. The freshmen are determined to make a great success this year, and from the early results we may conclude that their boasts and determination have not been asserted in vain. They are already taking part in the vim and excitement of high school life. Walter Disney, one of the newcomers, has displayed unusual artistic talent and has become a voice cartoonist. Walt, at last, was getting his cartoon published. They were facile and humorous and reflected his own impatience to join the war effort. Roy had enlisted in the Navy, and Walt was envious when his older brother came home from the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in his sailor's uniform. Walt had grown as tall as Roy, but he was still too young to enlist. He inscribed his cartoons for The Voice with such slogans as "Your Summer Vacation," "Work or Fight," and "Buy War Saving Stamps, Save and Serve." One of his cartoons showed two slackers scoffing at a doughboy. Wounded, hey? Well, that is too bad. While a pair of policemen threatened, "We'll nab those two loafers when the soldier leaves them." Walt also served as photographer for The Voice, and he studied anatomy, pen technique, and cartooning 3 nights a week at the Art Institute of Chicago. Among his teachers were Carrie Orr, cartoonist for the Chicago Tribune, and Leroy Gossett of the Herald, and Walt was permitted to visit them at the newspaper offices. He worked long hours over drawings in his room, never revealing a project until he completed it. He began assembling a gag file. He sat for hours in vaudeville houses, scribbling down jokes for cartoons. He also copied gags from burlesque comedians at the Haymarket and the Star and Garter. This was a time when burlesque offered family entertainment, not the bawdiness of a later era. Walt compiled the jokes and tried out the best ones on his father. Elias listened to them without a smile. 2 days later, he would remark straight-faced to his son, "You know, I've been thinking about that joke you told me. Walter, it's funny. Very funny." Elias Disney could not understand his son's fascination with the entertainment world, nor did he sympathize with Walt's ambition to be a cartoonist, but he agreed to pay for the boys' correspondence courses in art, as long as Walt contributed to the family income. Walt worked as handyman in the jelly factory, washing jars and capping them, mashing apples for pectin, nailing up boxes. One night, he served as night watchman, patrolling the factory with a .38 caliber revolver and a flashlight. He turned on all the lights and kept the gun in his hand so burglars would know he was armed. The jelly factory paid him only $7 a week, and Walt quit to work as a guard and gateman on the Wilson Avenue elevated railway line at 40 cents an hour. Each afternoon, Walt donned his cap and badge and rode the elevated to the terminus in Chicago. If too many gatemen appeared for work, Walt returned home. Usually he was assigned to the rear gate, where he loaded a car with commuters, then rang the bell twice to signal the motorman to leave the station. When Walt finished his freshman year at McKinley High School in the spring of 1918, he and a friend applied for summer jobs at the post office. The friend lied about his age and was hired, but Walt admitted that he was 16 and was turned away. He went home and penciled a few lines on his face, borrowed his father's suit and hat, and returned to the same employment window, declaring he was 18. He was hired. Walt worked from 12 to 14 hours a day, sorting the mail and making special deliveries throughout the city, riding free on streetcars and elevateds. One day, the supervisor asked if Walt could drive a truck. "Sure," he replied. He had once driven a 2-cylinder Buick in Kansas City. He was assigned to a white truck with 4 speeds forward and 4 reverse. Walt lurched through the Chicago streets on his deliveries, but by the time he returned to the garage, he had mastered the truck. On Sundays, he rode the streetcar to the end of the Grand Avenue Pier and collected the mail, mostly postcards from vacationers to the folks back home. Then he took the streetcar to the post office stables, harnessed a horse, hitched it to a mail wagon, and set out to pick up letters at boxes in front of the downtown hotels. The supervisor warned him, "Now, kid, leave that horse alone. He knows every box, and he knows his way back to the barn. Just keep your hands off the reins." It was hard to avoid the reins, especially when automobiles sped past the wagon, but the horse seemed to know what to do. At the Rush Street Bridge, which rose to allow boats to pass on the river, the horse came to a stop with its chest touching the chain. It waited stolidly for the bridge to lower, then proceeded to cross. Walt didn't need a route list. The horse halted beside every mailbox, and Walt jumped down to gather up the letters. As soon as he slammed the tailgate of the wagon, the horse began walking forward, and Walt had to run to catch up, stepping on the wheel hub to climb aboard. He realized that the slam was the horse's signal to start, so he He learned to ease the tailgate shut, then climb on the wagon and say, "Go on." The system worked perfectly until Walt reached a big hotel in the downtown loop. He went inside the lobby to collect the letters, and when he returned to the street, the horse was gone. Walt was in a panic. A horse with a wagon full of mail had disappeared in the busy downtown streets, and he was responsible. He ran to the corners and peered down each block, but there was no sign of the horse. He returned disconsolately to the hotel entrance and looked through the passageway to the next street. The horse was positioned patiently on the other side. Its routine was to proceed around the block and wait for the mailman to pass through the other side of the hotel. One day, Walt was sorting letters with his fellow mailmen and joked about how the postal inspector spied through holes in the walls. He noticed that the other men fell silent, and he turned around to find two uniformed inspectors standing beside him. "Disney, come with us," one of them said. He followed the two inspectors down a long corridor as hundreds of mail sorters watched. The two men took Walt to an office and began their interrogation. "2 Sundays ago, you picked up a bag of mail at the Grand Avenue Pier. What'd you do with it?" "I took it to the post office and put it down the chute." "No, you didn't. The mail never reached the post office. Tell us what you did with it." Walt was certain that he had deposited the mail as usual. Finally, one of the inspectors said, "Well, we'll tell you what you did with it. You hung it on a peg in the stable, and it's been there for 2 weeks. Now be more careful and get back to work." The summer of 1918 was the best that Walt had known. His hours for the post office were long, but there was no drudgery to the work, and he was outdoors most of the time. At night, he took girls from McKinley High School to movies and vaudeville shows. For the first time in his life, Walt had enough money to indulge himself, and he contemplated buying a movie camera or a canoe. A girlfriend urged him to buy a canoe, but he decided on the camera. He mounted it on a tripod in an alley and photographed himself in the imitations of Charlie Chaplin. To please his friends, he joined another boy in buying an inexpensive canoe. It was so small and unwieldy that he and the girl were swept out into the lake on a windy Sunday. By late summer, the Allies had stopped the Germans in the Second Battle of the Marne, and Marshal Foch had ordered a counterattack. Walt grew more impatient to get in uniform, telling his parents, "I don't want my grandchildren asking me, 'Why weren't you in the war? Were you a slacker?'" The Navy had transferred Roy to Charleston, South Carolina, and then assigned him to voyages between New York and France. Ray Disney had joined the Army. Walt wanted to take part in the same adventure. He couldn't conceive of returning to high school for another year. A friend at the post office, Russell Mass, shared his feelings. They decided to cross the border and enlist in the Canadian Army, which accepted younger recruits. Their plot was thwarted when Russell's mother discovered his packed suitcase. Her son admitted the plan, and she warned Flora Disney. One day, Russell arrived at the post office and told Walt excitedly, "There's something forming here that you and I can get into. It's a volunteer group called the American Ambulance Corps, part of the Red Cross. They need drivers, and they're not fussy about how old you are." At noon, the two young men hurried to the headquarters of the American Red Cross. They learned the age limit for ambulance unit volunteers was 17. Both were 16, but they falsified their ages and signed up as the St. John brothers, Russell and Walter. The ruse succeeded until the application for passports, which required their parents' signatures. Walt was forced to disclose his plan to his parents. "I will not sign any permission," Elias Disney declared. "It's signing a death warrant for my son." Flora Disney argued that 3 of their sons had left the family home by stealth, and she didn't want Walter to go the same way. "The boy is determined," she said. "I would rather sign this and know where he is than have him run off." "Well, you can sign it for me. I won't," Elias replied, and he stalked from the room. Flora forged his name on the passport application, and Walt altered his birth date to read 1900. He and Russell Mass returned to the Red Cross, and their applications were accepted. The 2 boys received uniforms and reported to a tent encampment at a burned-down amusement park near the University of Chicago. Mechanics from the Yellow Cab Company taught them how to repair motors and drive cars over rough terrain. An influenza epidemic struck Chicago, and Walt became so sick that he was ordered to a hospital. The ambulance driver asked him, "You live in Chicago, kid?" When Walter said that he did, the driver suggested, "We better take you home. With this flu going on, you never come out of the hospital alive." Walt took the advice. 2 of his close friends had been taken to the hospital, and they had died the next day. Flora Disney nursed her son through the days of high fever and delirium, giving him poultices and heavy doses of quinine. Because his bedroom had no heat, Walt occupied his parents' room. When little Ruth became ill, her bed was placed beside the kitchen stove. Flora herself caught the influenza, which was killing Chicagoans by the hundreds, but she continued caring for her 2 children. Finally, the fever broke. Walt regained strength and returned to the ambulance corps. He was dismayed to learn that his outfit, including Russell Mass, had shipped out. Walt was assigned to a new unit and was sent to South Beach, Connecticut to await passage to France. November 11, 1918 brought jubilation to the country, but the Red Cross volunteers at Sound Beach created the armistice with ambivalent feelings. The reason for their volunteering had gone, and they had faced the future at peacetime chauffeurs. They called themselves Coxey's Army, after the ragtag band of unemployed who marched on Washington in 1894, and they grumbled about camp discipline, complaining they were treated like draftees. Homesickness became endemic. Walt missed his mother's cooking, and he longed to see the girl who had promised to wait for his return. Early one morning, lights flashed on in the barracks, and the awakening volunteers heard a shout up. Up, everybody, 50 guys going to France. A bunkmate shook Walt and said, "Hey, Diz, wake up, they're shipping out 50 guys." Walt replied groggily, "They won't pick me," and he returned to sleep. The 50th name called was Walter E. Disney. His companions rolled him out of bed, and within an hour he was on the train to Hoboken, New Jersey. That night, November 18th, he embarked for France aboard a rusting cattle ship, the Valbonne. Valbonne. The disappointment over the end of the war was now forgotten, and the new adventure of crossing the Atlantic on a ship laden with ammunition. Although there was no reason to fear German U-boats, the ship had to pass through waters that had been heavily mined. Disregarding the danger, Walt slept directly over the magazine hatch. As the ship approached France, minesweepers came alongside to provide an escort through the hazardous channel. The Red Cross volunteers lined the railings to watch the minesweepers, long booms on each side, patrolling the waters, their gun crews scanning the surface for mines. At Cherbourg, huge anti-submarine nets parted to allow the Vauban to enter the port. The ship didn't land, but continued to Le Havre, arriving December 4th. Walt disembarked with his shipmates, and the young Miss Westerners toured the waterfront streets wonderingly. Few had been away from their own cities, and they were overwhelmed by the sights of the French seaport. They were astonished by the street corner urinals, and none could summon the nerve to use them. But after a day of sightseeing, one of the Americans could wait no longer. He stepped cautiously up to the pissoir, and his companions followed. Members of the American Ambulance Corps trooped to the railway station for the trip to Paris. Walt was fascinated to see how small the French engines seemed compared to those he had known in the summer as a news butcher. He stared out the window on the journey through the French countryside, noticing the high hedges and the groves of poplars that separated the small farms. Paris still looked like a city at war. As he rode a taxi down the Champs-Elysees, he saw the sidewalk filled with men in uniform. Sandbags still protected the monuments of the Etoile, and gun carts rattled through the streets. Walt had only a brief tour of the city before reporting to the American Ambulance Corps headquarters at Saint-Cyr, site of the French military academy. Saint-Cyr was his disappointment after the enticement of Paris. The volunteers were billeted in a chateau so dank and chill that Walt wrapped himself in newspapers before going to sleep on his cot. The food was dismal, mostly pork and beans. When December 5th arrived, Walt faced a grim 17th birthday. Late in the afternoon, he stopped by the canteen and found only one friend there. "Come on over to the bistro and I'll buy you a grenadine," the friend said. The pair walked to the nearby cafe and discovered it was deserted. As soon as they closed the door, Walt's friend emerged from under the tables and behind counters, shouting, "Happy birthday, Diz!" All crowded to the bar and ordered grenadine, wine, and cognac. They slapped Walt on the back and downed their drinks, leaving him to pay the bill. He emptied his money belt, but that was not enough. Walt had to sell his extra pair of Red Cross shoes for 30 francs. Walt was transferred from Saint-Cyr to Evacuation Hospital 5 in Paris. First, he drove 5-ton trucks and ambulances converted into small cars by cutting off the back end. Then he was assigned to the motor pool, in reality a taxi service for army officers. He soon learned the geography of Paris, driving majors and colonels to various headquarters, hospitals, legations, and on occasions bordellos. Headquarters assigned Walt to drive a white truck loaded with beans and sugar to the devastated areas of the Soissons. He selected an assistant and set off through the Paris suburbs and into the French countryside. After he had passed through a village, the motor started to clank. The news grew louder, and the chassis vibrated with the pounding of the engine. Finally, with a great rattling sound, the engine halted, and Walt coasted around a corner, parking off the road near a railway watchman's shack. Walt suspected that the truck had thrown a rod. No amount of tinkering would induce it to start again. He remembered the Red Cross driver's credo, "Never leave your vehicle," so he dispatched the assistant back to the village to ride a train to Paris and bring help. Walt resigned himself to a long wait in the February cold. He stayed in the cab for a few hours, but as night fell, his feet grew numb from the cold. In his hesitant French, he asked the railroad watchman if he could share the tiny shack. The watchman agreed, welcoming the young American's offer of the truck's emergency rations: bread, cheese, tinned beef, and chocolate. Walt dozed through the night in the 4-foot square shack, enjoying the warmth of the tiny stove, to which the watchman added a lump of coal every half hour. The next day brought no help from Paris, and Walt spent another night before the small stove. On the third day, he was so hungry and so numbingly tired that he walked to the village inn and ordered a meal and a bed. When the meal arrived, there was a cockroach among the lamb chops and peas. Walt merely pushed it off the plate, swallowed the food, and fell asleep on the bed. He awoke in a panic, discovering that he had slept for 24 hours. He raced back to the railroad crossing and discovered to his horror that his truck was gone. He trudged back to the village, dreading the consequences when he returned to Paris. A freight train arrived, and the trainman allowed him to ride in the cupola on one of the cars. When Walt arrived at headquarters, he discovered what had happened. His assistant had enjoyed a 2-day drunk before reporting the breakdown. The disabled truck was towed back to Paris, its cargo intact. Disney faced serious charges of abandoning his truck. A friendly sergeant from Evacuation Hospital 5 appeared before a board of officers and argued that the young driver had done all that was physically possible by remaining near his truck for 2 nights. The board agreed, and no discipline was imposed. The errant assistant landed in the guardhouse. Americans continued leaving France in the post-war months, and little work remained for the Red Cross motor pool. Disney was reassigned to a canteen in Neufchâteau, near Nancy. During long hours of idleness, Walt got out his pad and pencil and began cartooning. He mailed cartoons to Life and Judge, America's 2 leading humor magazines. All were returned with polite, printed notices of rejection. Composing a letter to his high school magazine, he illustrated it with a self-portrait and impression of soldiers and prisoners of war he had seen. He drew posters for the canteen and caricatures for the soldiers to send home, and he decorated the canvas top of his ambulance with an alluring female. Borrowing a croix de guerre from a French officer, he painted a replica of the medal on his jacket. Others at the canteen admired it and paid him to do the same on their jackets. He teamed up with an enterprising Georgian who had established a souvenir industry. The Georgian, realizing the desire of homeward-bound doughboys to collect mementos of the war, especially those soldiers who'd seen no combat. When the troop trains stopped at Neufchâteau to change engines, he went down the aisle selling German helmets he had collected on battlefields. One day, he noticed that Walt had painted his footlockers in a camouflage colors. "Hey, Diz, can you paint me a sniper's helmet?" asked the entrepreneur. Walt obliged, and he aged the helmets with quick-drying shellac, earning him 5 francs apiece. The Georgian rubbed the helmets in the dirt, shot holes in them, attached hair to the jagged edges, and sold them on the troop trains at inflated prices. Walt mailed the profits from his enterprise to his mother, along with half of his monthly salary of $52. One day, he entered a barracks craps game and emerged with $300. He hurried to the American Express office and dispatched the money to his mother with instructions to buy his sister Ruth a watch and bank the rest. A dozen years later, Walt reminisced about the days at Neufchâteau in a letter to Alice Hole, a Nebraska woman who operated the Red Cross canteen. "Just in case you can't place me, I will try to give you a brief outline of the work I did. I was a chauffeur of the canteen car. It was my duty to hang around the canteen all day and run errands. I used to drive the girls back and forth from the canteen to headquarters, take them into the country to buy eggs, drive them to the army commissary for supplies, and occasionally on picnics. My main hangout was a little shanty attached to the canteen where the bread was cut. You will perhaps remember the time that General Pershing sent his son Warren down to spend the day with you and me, and we all got into the little car I drove and went up to Domremy, Joan of Arc's birthplace, and had a wonderful picnic with fried chicken, all sorts of good things to eat. And boy, how good that fried chicken tasted. I remember some of the boys from the 2nd Cavalry who used to be around the canteen, and I also remember the squad of German prisoners who worked in the shower rooms. I especially remember one of the prisoners whom I liked real well. I believe his name was Rupert. I remember how they used to play tricks on him to get me to buy things for him. One day, Rupert came to me with an empty wine bottle in his hand and gave me some money, saying that Miss Howe wanted me to buy her some wine. I carried out his orders, although all the time wondering how it happened Miss Howe wanted me to buy her wine. When I returned, Rupert was waiting for me and insisted that he'd take the wine to you. I did not think any more about it until half an hour later when I went to the shower rooms. I found all the German prisoners having a great time on that bottle of wine. That was the only one of the pranks Rupert and his gang played on me. When the prisoners went on work crews, Walt and Rupert sat in the canteen car and talked about the war and the future of Germany. They became friends and helped each other in finding out ways to relieve the daily tedium. One day they drove to the outskirts of a village where the prisoners loaded cordwood into trucks. School children strolled by on their way from school. They had never seen German soldiers before, and they started throwing rocks. Walt told Rupert, who spoke fluent French, to order the children to stop. They persisted, and on Walt's suggestion, the prisoners filed their pockets with rocks. When the school children ignored a second order to stop, Walt called, "Rupert, charge!" And the prisoners loosed a fusillade of rocks and chased the children into the village. Walt was assigned to chauffeur two dignitaries on the tour of the foreign country, and before leaving, he consulted the village priest on what to see. He gained a reputation as an expert guide, and he drove other visitors through France and Germany. On one trip, he arrived in Strasbourg on July 14, 1918, to witness the first Bastille Day celebration in 50 years for the recaptured city. In August, the Neufchateau canteen was disbanded, and Walt was transferred to Paris. He found the city changed, the uniforms were disappearing, and the tempo and attitude of Parisians were returning to normal. Walt found that the American Ambulance Corps headquarters at St. Cyr had been shut down, and his friends in the organization had departed. The Red Cross issued a call for ambulance drivers for a war in Albania, and Walt was tempted by the salary of $150 a month, more than he'd ever earned. Then he encountered Russell Mass, the Chicago boy with whom he had joined the Red Cross. They talked of home, and over French coffee and cognac, they conducted a scheme to build a raft and float down the Mississippi like a pair of Huck Finns. Both had brought German Shepherd puppies, and they agreed the dogs would join them on the voyage. Russell was returning to America immediately, and Walt paid $75 for his dog to go with Russell. The two young men from Chicago visited a photographic studio in Paris and posed for postcards to send to their friends and family back home. The two photographs afforded a character study of the 17-year-old Walt Disney. In one, he appeared in overseas cap, khaki uniform with jodhpurs and leggings, his heavy overcoat draped casually over his arm. He had been amused and proud. Then he posed in a battle helmet, looking like a doughboy he had wanted to be. He is grimly serious, dedicated, a traveler of the world. There can be no doubt what Walt intended the photographs to accomplish: to let those at home know that he had grown to manhood in France. On September 3rd, 1919, General Pershing and his staff departed from Paris, and other American units followed. The American Ambulance Corps was finally disbanded, and the remaining volunteers was dispatched to Marseille for passage home. When Walt Disney and his companions reached the dock, they found their ship floating high in the harbor, a dock strike preventing loading. The unit was ordered to Nice until the strike was solved, and for 3 weeks Walt lived a splendid life at the Riviera Resort. Then the strike ended, and Walt boarded the ship in Marseille for the voyage back to America and the start of his career. Chapter 5. A year in France had been a heady experience for a Midwestern not yet 18, and Walt Disney landed in New York brimming with hope and optimism. He was stimulated by the size and energy of Manhattan, and he wandered the streets with unabashed awe of the high buildings. Among the lights he found in New York were two comedies of Charlie Chaplin. Walt hurried home to Chicago, and like many other young men returning from overseas, he saw his hopes turn to ashes. He had brought French laces and perfume to the girl who had promised to wait for him, but she had married 3 months before. When Walt visited Russell Mass to claim his German Shepherd, he learned the dog had died of distemper. Russell had acquired a job and a girlfriend and lost all interest in a voyage down the Mississippi. Elias and Flora Disney were astonished at the change in their youngest son. He had grown to 5 feet 10 inches, and he was broad-shouldered and husky at 165 pounds. He had matured in other ways. His outlook was worldly, too much so for his father's taste. But Walt could still be boyishly playful, as when he described to his believing mother this huge Prudential insurance sign he had seen atop Gibraltar as a ship passed through the strait. He showed her a small box which he had said contained a battlefield souvenir. She shrieked when he opened it. Inside was a bloody human thumb. In reality, Walt's own, painted with iodine and stuck through the back of the box. A return to high school was unthinkable after Walt's European experiences, nor would he consider a job his father offered at the jelly factory for the handsome salary of $25 a week. "Dad, I don't want that kind of job," Walt insisted. Elias reminded him that thousands of unemployed veterans would welcome such a position, but Walt remained firm. "Then what do you want to do, Walter?" the father asked. "I want to be an artist," Walt replied. "And how do you expect to make a living as an artist?" Elias asked. "I don't know," Walt admitted. He knew that he didn't want to remain in Chicago. The city seemed noisy and dirty and unappealing. He decided to return to Kansas City. Roy had gone there after his discharge from the Navy at Seattle in February 1919. Walt wanted to see his boyhood friends, and he was convinced that the Kansas City Star would hire him as a political cartoonist. Against his father's wishes, Walt packed all his belongings, including the Red Cross uniform, and boarded a train for Kansas City. Walt and Roy Disney had a joyful reunion at the Disney house on Bellefontaine Street, and his brothers talked until early morning about their adventures overseas. Roy was working as a teller for the First National Bank of Kansas City at a salary of $90 a week. He was hoping for an advancement so he could marry Edna Francis, sister of Mitchell Francis, who had gone into the Navy with Roy and worked at the same bank. Walt told Roy of his plans to become a political cartoonist, and he displayed drawings he had done in France. He packed up the drawings and went to the office of the Star, where he was curtly informed that there was no openings for a cartoonist. Walt decided he would work his way up through the ranks, and he answered in an advertisement for a copy boy at the Star. Wearing his Red Cross uniform to lend him maturity, it worked too well, and he was told he was too old for the job. Walt protested that he was only 18, but the employment man was unhearing. He cited Walt's experience as a Red Cross driver and suggested that he apply for work in the transportation department. "I want to be a cartoonist, not a driver," Walt replied. He took his cartoon samples to the Kansas City Journal and drew a favorable reaction from the editor, Lawrence Dickey, but the journal had no immediate need for another cartoonist. Walt reported his disappointments to Roy, who tried to persuade his brother to seek more practical employment. Roy mentioned his brother's plight to another bank worker, who told them of two commercial artists who were seeking an apprentice. Roy telephoned his brother and told him to apply at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Arts Studio in the Gray Advertising Building. Walt hurried downtown and met Louis Pesman and Bill Rubin, who were impressed with the young man's eager manner. They asked him to return with samples of his artwork, and he showed them his sketches of Parisian streets. Pesman and Rubin told him to report for work the following day, the salary to be determined later. The new employee was assigned to create rough drawings of advertisements and letterheads for farm equipment and supply companies. The first job was for a firm that sold egg-laying mash, and Walt sketched hens on nests, eggs overflowing nests, hens hatching dollar signs. Lou Pesman, who taught night school at the Fine Arts Institution, had noted that most of the young artists resented criticism. Not Disney. One day he was working on a layout for the Cary Salt Company, drawing cows licking salt blocks. Pesman looked over his shoulder, erased some lines, added others, and Walt welcomed the changes. At the end of the week, the two partners announced that their new assistant would be paid $50 a month. "That'll do fine," said Walt, not looking up from his work. When he reported the news to Roy, he admitted that he would have accepted half that amount. Walt was eager to please his new employers. Pesman designed covers for the weekly program in the Newman Theater, and he instructed Walt to finish the artwork on the front cover. It was a job that normally would have required a day, but Walt finished both the front and the back covers in 3 hours, adding original touches of his own. He was assigned to the artwork for the Newman Theater newspaper advertisements, and years later, in an advertising conference at his Burbank studio, he recalled one of his contributors. "The Newman was playing a Cecil B. DeMille picture, male and female, and all I had to work with was a standing photo of the stars Gloria Swanson and Thomas May. Well, I thought it would make a better ad if they were lying down, and that's how I drew them." A co-worker at Pesman Rubin was a stolid young Dutchman with the curious name of Ub Iwerks. The son of a Dutch immigrant, he was the same age as Walt. Like Walt, Ub had left high school before graduating. Ub had worked for a banknote company on a farm, and then was hired by Pesman Rubin in the fall of 1919 to do lettering and airbrush work. When Walt Disney arrived a month later, the two 18-year-olds became friends. Walt showed Ub the lettering samples he had executed when he was hired. Most applicants lettered the alphabet, but Walt had written variations of his own name: Walter Disney, W.E. Disney, Walt Disney, Walter Elias Disney. He asked Ub which one seemed best. "Walt Disney," said Ub, and Walt agreed. Both young men turned out a large volume of artwork for farm catalogs and Christmas ads for department stores and theaters. Then the pre-holiday rush ended, and both Walter and Ub were let go. Walter applied for work with the post office, and he delivered mail until after New Year's. Walt and Ub Iwerks, he later shortened his name. I apologize. Walt and Ubby Iwerks, he later shortened his name to Ub Iwerks, discussed going into business for themselves. Walter Pfeiffer, Walt's boyhood pal and co-performer, persuaded his father to hire the two artists to design lettering for the United Leatherworkers Journal. Walt searched for other business, and he called on former neighbor Al Carter, who edited a trade publication, The Restaurant News. Carter said he didn't have enough work to keep the two young artists busy, but he offered them a couple of desks in his office in return for an occasional design. Walt saw this as a chance to begin his and Ub's enterprise. He wrote his mother to send him the $500 he had earned as a Red Cross worker and sometimes crap shooter in France. His mother insisted on knowing why he wanted the money. He replied that he was going into business, adding that it was his savings and he could do what he wanted with it. After more exchange of letters, she sent him half the money. The partners intended to call their enterprise Disney Eyeworks, but when they put on the listings in the lobby of the Railroad Exchange Building, they discovered it sounded too much like an optical firm. So it became Eyeworks Disney, commercial artists. Eyeworks did the straight drawings and lettering. Disney was the cartoonist and salesman. He hustled around to print shops, theaters, stores, and oil companies in search of work. The first month's business netted $135, more than they had been receiving at Pesman Rubin. The Eyeworks Disney firm lasted only a month. On January 29, 1920, Ub spotted an advertisement in the Kansas City Star. Artist. Cartoon and wash drawings, first class man wanted. Steady. Kansas City, Slide Company, 10:15 Central. Ub discussed the ad with Walt and both agreed that Walter should apply for the job. He reported for an interview with the head of the Kansas City Slide Company, A. Vern Calger, at the firm's office on Central Street. Calger was impressed with the young man's cartoons and offered him a position at $40 a week. Walt was overwhelmed by the salary, but he had hoped to work part-time while he and Ub continued their new enterprise. Calger insisted he wanted a full-time cartoonist. Walter discussed the matter with his partner, and Ub urged him to take the job. I can manage the business, Ub assured him, but he was not outgoing enough to be a salesman, and the business quickly dwindled. In March 1920, Walt persuaded Calger to hire Ub, and Eyeworks Disney went into limbo. After Walt had been working a few weeks at the Slide Company, which had moved to 2449 Charlotte with the new name of Kansas City Film Ad Company, he received a call from Lawrence Dickey of the Journal. The newspaper needed a cartoonist, and Walt could have the job. If the offer had come earlier, the course of his career might have proved far different, but Walt had been introduced to something that intrigued him more than the newspaper cartooning. He declined the Journal's offer. Now he was making cartoons that moved. Kansas City Film Ad produced 1-minute advertising films to appear in motion picture theaters. The animation was primitive. Humans and animal figures were cut out of paper and pinned to a sheet. The joints of the figures were moved in the photographed, creating the illusion of movement. The artists made their cutouts and gave them to the cameramen with an outline of the action. Each department was jealous of its own secrets and declined to share them, but Walt was curious to learn how things worked. He made friends with the cameraman, Jimmy Lauer, who showed the young cartoonist how the paper figures were photographed in stop motion to provide the illusion of animation. Soon, Lauer permitted Walt to operate the camera himself. Walt wasn't satisfied with such a crude method of animation. He noted how the New York made movie cartoons like the Mutt and Jeff and Kogo the Clown series moved with greater realism. They were created with drawings, not cutouts, and Walt was determined to learn how. He found 2 books in the Kansas City Public Library, one a simple handbook by Carl Lutz on the essentials of animation, the other, Edward Muybridge's classic study of human and animal motion. Walt pored over Muybridge's photographs of running horses and athletes in motion, then had the pages copied by a photostat firm. He returned the book to the library and kept a stack of photostats beside his desk as a guide for his drawings. His employers were delighted with the improved realism of the drawn cartoons, and he and began turning them out for Film Ad. Walt was dissatisfied with the material given to him by the Film Ad copywriters, and he began injecting gags of his own. In an ad for a bank, he depicted a man floating down a river on a raft with a catchline, "You can't drift through your life." For another bank, he drew a locomotive chasing a cow. "You'll never get anywhere until you get on the right savings track." For a maker of canvas card covers, he showed an automobile with a sparkling top. The dialogue between owner and friend. "Hi, old top. New car?" "No, old car. New top." The Film Ad Company made live-action movies as well as cartoons, and Walt portrayed paint salesmen or garage mechanics in the films. When an automobile careened down a nearby hill and crashed onto its side in front of the Film Ad office, a resourceful filmmaker grabbed a camera and shouted, "Come on, Diz, follow me!" Walt hurried outside and climbed into the overturned car. The cameraman spun the wheel and threw some dust in the air as the dazed young man emerged from the accident. The film became an ad for an insurance company. Walt and Roy Disney were living with their brother Herbert and his wife in the house their parents still owned at 3028 Bellefontaine. Both young men often visited the home of Roy's sweetheart, Edna Francis, arriving conveniently at mealtime. During the meal and often into the night, Walt talked about his work at FilmAd and his plans to advance beyond advertising films into something more rewarding. The young artist was developing a style. While his vocabulary was unpolished and he sometimes used barracks language, he could express himself surprisingly well, especially when he was relating a fable or gag sequence he planned to draw. Now that he was earning a steady salary, he could afford to dress with a flair. Photographs show him as a young man in a jaunty tweed cap, twin double-breasted dark suit with gray vest, his four in hand neatly tied. He is swinging a golf club in a city park and clowning in a statue pose atop a giant urn, a cigar clamped on the side of his mouth. Then he appears at the Kansas City Artist Ball in full Western regalia, looking as handsome as a Hollywood cowboy. He was full grown at almost 6 feet and had no trouble getting dates with the girls who worked for the film ad. Walt's ingenuity distinguished his work at FilmAd and sometimes covered up his lack of draftsmanship. Assigned to a theater commercial for a hat company, he realized that he couldn't draw the handsome faces ordinarily seen in hat ads. Instead, he drew comic faces under the hats, and they delighted Calgar and theater audience as well. Walt wanted to do his own experimenting, and he asked Calgar for the loan of one of the company's stop action cameras. Calgar resisted at first, but Walt continued asking him, and he gave in. Walt enlisted Roy to help rig a makeshift studio in the family garage. Working past midnight every night, Walt experimented with incandescent lights called inkies until he achieved the best exposure for his drawings. He needed a subject that would capture local attention, and he decided to explore the anger of Kansas City citizens over the poor repair of city streets. In the hyperbolic style that marked his early cartooning, he depicted drivers loosening their teeth when striking ruts, trucks disappearing into gaping holes. He wanted to photograph his own hand making the drawings in the manner of the Out of the Inkwell cartoons, but he couldn't fit his hand under the camera. So he made a photograph of his hand and moved the photograph under the camera to create the illusion that he was drawing. Walt completed 300 feet of cartoon and took the film to the Newman Theater Company, which show in three movie houses in Kansas City. I like it, kid, said the manager, Melton Field. I can use one every week. How much do they cost? Walt calculated his expenses and replied, 30 cents a foot. Field agreed to pay that amount, and Walt left the office elated, until he realized that the 30-cent figure did not provide any margin for profit. Worked all day at FilmAd, then spent hours each night in his garage studio. Feld gave him suggestions for new cartoons, a theater anniversary, a political campaign, a Christmas program. Feld asked Walt's help with the bothersome problems for theaters, patrons who bothered their neighbors by reading aloud the titles for the silent movies. Walt created a comical professor who slammed a mallet on the head of the title readers, or released a trapdoor that shooted them to the streets. Walt named the films Newman's Laughograms. A few of them have survived, and though they show surprising skill in an artist so new to animation. The cartoonist's hand skims over the paper, seeming to make the droll drawings in lightning speed. As his knowledge of cartooning grew, Walt introduced real animation. Kansas City Spring Cleanup, obviously based on one of the city's periodic police scandals, shows a parade of policemen marching into headquarters, signs of a struggle from within. Thin bodies fly out. A man exits from the building to hang a sign, Cops Wanted. There can be no doubt that the scandal-weary Kansas City audience reacted with applause. The Newman Laughograms began making a minor celebrity of Walt Disney. When he met friends from Penton School, they remarked about seeing his films. His boss at FilmAd was proud of Walt's achievements and always introduced the young man to important visitors. Calgar asked to borrow the Laughograms to show his company's offices in other cities what could be done with cartoons for theaters. Walt had been urging Calgar to buy sheets of celluloid so the staff could copy the methods of the New York cartoon studios. Walt ordered 100 new celluloids. The purchasing agent changed the order to cheap discards, and they arrived scratched and ink-stained. But Walt and his fellow workers cleaned each one with solvent and soft cloths. For Walt, it was a thrill finally to make cartoons on celluloid, as all the important New York cartoonists did. His vision grew. Why don't we make a series of cartoon shorts to sell to theaters? He proposed to Calgar. The company owner rejected the suggestion. FilmAd had a thriving business of selling advertising movies to theaters throughout the Midwest. He saw no reason to attempt something new and risky. Roy Disney had proved himself a steady, conscientious worker at the First National Bank, and his salary had increased enough to allow him and Edna Francis to talk seriously about getting married. During 1920, Roy suffered 2 serious attacks of influenza, and his doctor doctor recommended removal of his tonsils. His brother Herb suggested a surgeon who would perform the operation during Roy's lunch hour at the bank. Roy had the surgery done one noon and returned to his job. His throat hemorrhaged and Mitchell Francis rushed him home. Afterwards, x-rays detected a spot on Roy's lungs. It was tuberculosis. The Veteran Administration assigned him to a hospital in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was a tearful parting for Roy and Edna. 5 years would pass before they could marry. Again, Elias Disney failed. His investment in the jelly factory disappeared in bankruptcy, and the company president was in prison for fraud. Again, Elias sought to improve his fortune by moving on. He and Flora returned to Kansas City, where he sought work as a carpenter. Elias found the garage at the Bellefontaine house taken over by Walt's contraptions. Elias didn't understand why his son wasted his time on such things, but he allowed Walt to continue using the garage for a rental of $5 a month. Elias found little work in a housing industry hit by the post-war slump. He helped one of Flora's relatives build a house in Glendale, California, but decided against moving there because the country was too arid. The Postal Service had transferred Herb to Portland, Oregon, and he urged his parents to join him. Elias decided they would. In November 1921, he and Flora and Ruth left Kansas City by train. Walt went to the station for their departure, and Ruth noticed tears forming in his eyes. He said his goodbyes and left abruptly. New owners moved into the Bellefontaine house, and Walt shifted his belongings to a rooming house. His enterprise had outgrown the garage, and he now rented a small shop. He could no longer do all the work himself, and he advertised for boys who wanted to learn the cartoon business. 3 applied, and Walt conducted night school in the tiny shop, teaching the elements of cartooning. He told the boys he couldn't afford to pay them, but he promised they would share in future profits of the enterprise, for which he confidently predicted success. To achieve that success, Laugh-O-Grams needed to progress beyond the 1-minute program filler. The next step would be cartoon shorts like those produced by the New York studios. He devised plans for a series of cartoons based on traditional fairy tales, modernized and sprinkled with gags. For 6 months, Walt and his youthful filmmakers worked at nights on their first production, Little Red Riding Hood. Walt was so pleased with the cartoon that he quoted his position at FilmAd, where he had been earning an impressive $60 a week. On May 23, 1922, he incorporated Laugh-O-Grams Films with $15,000 from local investors, who had contributed from $250 to $500 apiece. The new firm's capital equipment included 3 inkers and tracers tables, 7 chairs, 3 animated booths, 1 cabinet, 1 superintendent's desk, projector, winder, electric fan, 800 feet of positive film, 1 still camera, movie camera and stand, lighting equipment, and copying stand. Walt persuaded UB Iwerks to leave FilmAd, and Laugh-O-Gram Films took over the remaining assets of Iwerks' Disney commercial artists. They were joined by 5 other young animators: Hugh Harman, Rudolph Ising, Carmen Maxwell, Lori Teague, Otto Welleman, as well as a business manager, a girl who inked and painted their celluloids, a salesman, and a secretary. All worked in a 5-room suite on the 2nd floor of the McConaughey building at the 35th Street and Forest. Laugh-O-Gram started production of a series of fairy tale films following the pattern of Little Red Riding Hood. The salesman went to New York to hunt for buyers, and he made a releasing deal with a non-theatrical distribution company, Pictorial Clubs. The company sent a check for $100 and a note promising $11,000 for 6 cartoons. The workers at Laugh-O-Gram were jubilant, and Walt put 5 additional subjects into production: The 4 Musicians of Bremen, Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella. The Laugh-O-Gram office was an exhilarating place to work. The president of the company was 20 years old, and he declined to act the role of executive. He did some of the animation, operated the camera, washed the celluloid cells for reuse. Many of his employees were still in their teens, and they shared his zest for the cartoon medium, often working past midnight. They were unconcerned when they received only half of their salaries on weeks when the company treasury was low. On Sundays, they joined Walt in Swope Park or on the roof of their office building and acted out the charade of filming a melodrama. Walt bought a universal camera for $300, and it saw multiple duty. On weekends, Walt mounted on the rear seat of a touring car and rode through the downtown Kansas City streets, cranking the camera. His cap turned backwards like a Hollywood camera. A sign on the car read, "These pictures will be shown at the Isis Theater tomorrow night." Walt contracted with the Jenkins Music Company to make a film illustrating the song Martha, and he took 3 girls from the office to a nearby woods to film a sequence. He delighted in playing the director, complete with megaphone. He used the camera as Kansas City correspondent for Selznick, Path, and Universal Newsreels. When the New York offices telegraphed Disney with special assignments, cartoon filming ceased. Walt removed the camera from the cartoon stand, picked up a tripod, and hurried out to photograph a news event. He rode the streetcar to an automobile lot, rented a Ford motoring car, and placed a press sticker on the windshield. He received an important assignment to cover the American Legion convention, which was being attended by Vice President Coolidge, Marshal Foch, and General Pershing. The father of a school friend owned the building across the street from the reviewing stand, and Walt carried his camera to the roof. It was a perfect vantage point to film the dignitaries in the parade. Payment for such assignment was $1 for a foot of film. Usually 100 feet was ordered. If the newsreel did not use the film, the equivalent amount in unexposed negative was returned to him. Walt was convinced he could sell newsreel footage of airplane acrobatics, and he persuaded a couple of barnstorming pilots to perform for him. Walt consulted a cameraman friend on how to photograph in the air. He was told to stop down all you can, limit the exposure to the barest minimum. Walt took his camera up in one of the planes and photographed some daring stunts. When his film was developed, it was totally dark except for a white donut caused by the whirling propellers. He had stopped down too far. The camera was also used in taking baby pictures for proud Kansas City parents, that part of this enterprise resulting in publicity from the newspaper that Walt had once delivered, the Kansas City Star. The Laugh-O-Gram Films Company, Incorporated, 1127 East 31st Street, has added the feature of photographing youngsters to its regular business of making animated cartoons. An admiring parent wishing to preserve the native graces of his progeny's actions notifies Walt Disney, president of the corporation, and head cartoonist for the animated cartoons. The company furnishes a projector service with its filming, which provides that a private showing be made in the home. 3 showings for each 100 feet of film. By the autumn of 1922, it was becoming more and more difficult for the youthful filmmakers to maintain their exuberance. The fairy tale cartoons were being shipped off to pictorial clubs, but no money returned. Under the contract, no payment was required until 6 months after signing, and by that time, pictorial clubs had gone bankrupt. For producing the half-dozen 7-minute cartoons, Laugh-O-Grams had been paid only the deposit of $100. With salary checks growing thinner, Laugh-O-Gram employees began to drop out. Iworks left the company, returned to Film Ad. In late November, Walt persuaded his principal backer, Dr. Krause, to supply an additional $2,500 to satisfy the company's major creditors. Walt found himself unable to pay his rooming bill, and for a couple of weeks he roomed with Iworks. Then Walt took up lodgings in the Laugh-O-Gram offices. The rent had been paid in advance. Like others in the office, he ate on credit at the Forest Inn Cafe downstairs, operated by the pair of Greeks, Jerry Ragos and Louis Katzis. Since the office had no bath, Walt made a weekly journey to the railroad station where he bought a warm tub, a towel, and a bar of soap for a dime. After the bath, he stood on the platform where he had seen his parents, his sister, and Roy depart for the West. He couldn't avoid tears as he watched the passengers leaving for other towns and cities. It was so lonesome, he recalled in later years. One day in December, a local dentist, Thomas B. McCrum, paid a call to the Laugh-O-Gram office to inquire about a film to promote the dental office. He was surprised to find that young Disney was the only person in the office, but they discussed the film and agreed on a fee of $500. In later years, Walt liked to tell the story of how Dr. McCrum telephoned one evening and asked Walt to come to his house to complete the deal. Walt said that he couldn't. He confessed that his only pair of shoes was at the cobbler, and he didn't have the $1.50 to redeem them. The dentist came to the office and gave him money for the shoes in agreement for the dental health film. Walt hired back some of his Laugh-O-Gram workers for Tommy Tucker's tooth, and the unexpected revenue recharged his ambition. He searched for another subject to put Laugh-O-Gram back in business. He admired the out-of-the-inkwell cartoons produced by Max Fleischer, in which cartoon figures animated on the drawing boards of artists. Why not reverse the technique and put a human figure in a cartoon world? He devised the idea of Alice's Wonderland, in which a real girl would act out adventures amid cartoon figures. He hired Virginia Davis, a winsome 6-year-old model with Mary Pickford curls, and photographed her against a plain backdrop, devising a storyline that would be drawn later. He sent off enthusiastic letters to distributors in New York. One letter, dated May 14, 1923, went to a woman named Margaret M.J. Winkler, who distributed Out of the Inkwell and other cartoons. "We have just discovered something new and clever in animated cartoons. The first subject of this distinctly different series is now in production and will require a few weeks more for completion. It is a new idea that will appeal to all classes and is bound to be a winner because it is a clever combination of live characters and cartoons, not like Out of the Inkwell or Oral Herds, but of an entirely different nature, using a cast of live child actors who carry on their action on cartoon scenes with cartoon characters. These new subjects will be a full reel in length and can be released at regular intervals of 2 weeks or a month. Disney suggested that Winkler see Laugh-O-Gram's previous cartoons for pictorial clubs as an example of the company's work. She replied with an encouraging letter and Walt began production, but his resources dwindled further. Dr. Cowles advanced him an occasional $10. Roy, who had moved from Santa Fe to another hospital in Tucson, sent Walt a blank check with instructions to fill out any amount up to $30. Walt wrote it for $30. The money soon disappeared, and Walt's bill at the Greek restaurant continued to mount. When it reached $60, Jerry said his partner wouldn't allow him to extend any more credit. 2 days later, Jerry went up to Laugh-O-Gram office and found Walt sitting on a box and eating beans out of a can. "Oh, Walter," said the Greek, "I don't care what my partner says. You go downstairs and get something to eat." With Alice's Wonderland half finished, Walt found himself completely out of funds. Walt went to his early investors and asked them to help keep Laugh-O-Gram in business, but they had already resigned themselves to losing their money and saw no reason to throw away more. On June 18th, Walt dispatched a brave letter to Winkler. "Owing to numerous delays and backsets we have encountered in moving into our new office, we will not be able to complete the first picture of our new series by the time we expected. However, it will be finished very soon, and the writer expects to be in New York about the 1st of July with a print of same and an outline of our future programming." Unable to pay the rent of the McConaughey building, Walt moved to a smaller quarters, but there was no way to continue. He described his situation in a letter to Roy, who had moved to a veterans hospital at Salto, west of Los Angeles. Roy replied, "Kid, I think you should get out of there. I don't think you'd do any more of it." Walt resigned himself to bankruptcy. When settlement was made years later, the creditors received 45% of their claims. A modest income had been received from the successors to the pictorial clubs. Another cartoon maker in Kansas City offered Walt a job, but he wanted to leave the scene of his failure and to leave the cartoon business as well. Instead of heading for New York, where the cartoon studios were centered, he was going to Hollywood, where he planned to become a director. His only problem was raising the railroad fare. He went door to door photographing babies and sold his camera and bought a one-way ticket to California. He left Kansas City in July wearing a checkered coat and non-matching pants. He had $40 in cash and his imitation leather suitcase contained only a shirt, 2 undershirts, 2 pairs of socks, some drawing materials. But when he paid his fare for the trip to California, he bought a first-class ticket. Well, thank you everyone for participating. That was section 1 of Bob Thomas's book, Walt Disney, an American Original. Until next time, remember that today's special moments are tomorrow's memories. Goodbye.